The letter that brought Jasper Prescott back to Cedar Creek had promised him a wedding, but the wind that met him at the edge of town in October of 1878 carried instead the smell of fresh-turned earth, and something in his chest told him before any man spoke a word that he had come home too late. He had ridden 300 miles from the railhead at Cheyenne, his gelding footsore and his own body worn thin from 2 years of cattle trails, broken promises, and a jail cell in Abilene he had no business sitting in. He had a satchel of hard-earned wages tied behind his saddle, and a ring wrapped in a handkerchief inside his coat pocket, and he had rehearsed 100 times what he would say to Virginia Crawford when at last he stood before her on the porch of the Crawford ranch house, the same porch where she had kissed him goodbye beneath a sky full of Wyoming stars. Instead, the first person he found in Cedar Creek was Mrs. Odell, who kept the boarding house near the livery, and who looked at him the way a woman looks at a ghost when he asked after the Crawford family. "Jasper Prescott," she said, setting down her broom slow, like the weight of what she had to say had settled into her hands. "Lord above, we all thought you were dead or gone for good." "I was working," he said. "There was trouble on the drive and then trouble after the drive. Took me longer than I aimed. Where is she, Mrs. Odell? Where is Virginia?" The old woman's face crumpled, and she reached out and took his forearm the way one might steady a man before telling him the ground had opened beneath his feet. "She is buried out past the Ridge Road, Jasper. Fever took her this summer past on the trail west. I am so sorry, son." "I truly am." He did not remember walking to his horse. He did not remember the ride out along the Ridge Road, though later he would recall the sound of his own heartbeat louder than his gelding's hooves, and the way the cottonwoods along the creek had already begun to turn gold and were shedding their leaves onto the water like something already grieving. He found the little burying ground at the top of the rise, a fenced square of graves with crooked wooden markers, and Mrs. Odell had told him which one, and he dismounted and walked to it on legs that did not feel entirely his own. He knelt in the dry grass and looked at the marker, and for a long moment his mind refused to read what was written there because it did not make sense, and a man's mind will fight against a thing that does not make sense even while his heart is breaking. The marker read, "Adeline Foster, beloved friend, passed from this life June 1878. Jasper Prescott sat back on his heels in the grass with the wind moving through the dry weeds around him, and he stared at that name for a long time, and slowly, terribly, a new and different kind of fear began to climb up out of his chest to replace the grief, because if that was not Virginia's name on the marker, then perhaps the woman in that grave was not Virginia Crawford at all. And if that was true, then where in God's earth was she? To understand how a man could come to kneel weeping over a stranger's grave, believing it belonged to the woman he loved, one has to go back 2.5 years, to the spring of 1876, when Jasper Prescott was 27 years old and still believed the world mostly kept its promises. He had come to Cedar Creek that spring driving a small herd for a rancher out of Laramie, and he had stayed on afterward to break horses for Thomas Crawford, a widower who ran 3,000 head of cattle on good grass along the creek bottom, and who had one daughter, Virginia, 23 years old, dark-haired, quick-tongued, and utterly unimpressed by cowboys who thought themselves charming. Jasper had not thought himself charming. He had thought himself, if anything, plain and slow to talk, a man more comfortable with horses than with people, and it was that very quality that had first caught Virginia's attention, because every other young man in Cedar Creek territory seemed to want to impress her, and Jasper Prescott seemed content simply to notice her. He noticed the way she rode a horse better than most men in the county. He noticed the way she kept her father's account books in a hand so neat it looked printed. He noticed that she read Shakespeare aloud to the ranch hands on Sunday evenings, not because anyone had asked her to, but because she loved the sound of the words, and she did not care one bit if the cowboys understood half of what she read. "You are staring, Mr. Prescott," she told him one evening in June, when he had lingered too long by the corral fence listening to her read from a battered volume of sonnets she kept in her saddlebag. "I am listening," he said. "A man can do both. Most men who stare are not listening to a word. Then I suppose I am not most men." She had laughed at that. A real laugh, not the polite kind she gave to town boys who called on her with flowers and empty compliments. And something had settled between them that evening that neither of them tried to name for a long while, though both of them felt its weight. By August they were walking together in the evenings along the creek, and by September he had kissed her beneath the cottonwoods, and by the following spring, in April of 1877, he had asked Thomas Crawford for permission to court his daughter properly, with the intention of marriage. And Thomas Crawford, who liked Jasper Prescott's steady hands and steadier character, had given his blessing without much hesitation. "You will need land of your own," Thomas Crawford told him, sitting on the porch with a pipe he rarely lit anymore on account of his cough. "A man cannot come to me empty-handed and expect to keep my daughter in the manner she deserves." "I mean to earn it, sir," Jasper said. "There is good money in driving cattle north to the railheads. 2 seasons of it, maybe less, and I will have enough to buy a parcel along the West Fork and build her a house with a real floor in it, not packed dirt." Virginia, listening from the doorway, had rolled her eyes at both of them, though her cheeks were flushed with feeling. "I do not need a house with a floor," she said. "I need a man who comes home." "I will come home," Jasper had told her, taking her hand right there in front of her father, which was a bold thing to do, but he did not care. "I promise you that, Virginia Crawford. Whatever it takes, I will come home to you." He had left in May of 1877 with a trail crew bound for the railhead at Abilene, Kansas, driving 1,100 head of longhorn cattle across 400 miles of open range, through river crossings swollen with spring rain, through a stampede that killed 2 men and scattered the herd across 20 miles of prairie, through the ever-present threat of rustlers and the exhausting monotony of dust and heat and saddle sores that any man who has ridden a cattle trail will tell you is a truer test of a man's character than any gunfight ever was. He had written to her from every town with a post office, though the letters were often weeks or months in reaching Cedar Creek, carried by stagecoach and sometimes simply by whatever rider happened to be heading that direction with room in his saddlebags. She had written back the same way, and for a time the letters had been a kind of lifeline strung across 400 miles of prairie, each one a small proof that the promise still held. Then, in Abilene, in the fall of 1877, a saloon brawl that Jasper Prescott had no part in starting had ended with a man dead and Jasper, who had only tried to pull 2 drunken cowhands apart, arrested and held for 3 months while the local marshals sorted out who had actually done the killing. By the time the truth came clear, and Jasper was released, with an apology from the marshal and precious little else, winter had set into the plains, and travel back to Wyoming territory was slow and dangerous, and the letters he had sent explaining his delay had gone, as it turned out later, entirely astray, lost somewhere in the chaos of a territory still without reliable mail service in every direction. He did not know, riding those last months back toward Cedar Creek in the spring and summer of 1878, working odd jobs to replace money lost during his months in custody, that Thomas Crawford had died of pneumonia the previous winter, or that a hard-eyed cattle baron named Silas Thorne, who held notes on debts Thomas Crawford had taken out years before to expand his herd, had come calling on the grieving Virginia Crawford within weeks of her father's burial, offering to forgive the debt entirely in exchange for her hand in marriage, and making it clear, in the particular soft-spoken way of men who are used to getting what they want, that refusal would mean the loss of the only home she had ever known. Jasper Prescott knew none of this. He knew only that he was coming home with money in his pocket at last, later than he had promised but faithful to his word all the same, and that he intended to marry Virginia Crawford before the first snow. He did not know, kneeling now in the dry grass of a hillside cemetery with a stranger's name staring back at him from a wooden marker, that the woman he loved was, at that very hour, very much alive. The undertaker in Cedar Creek was a thin, careful man named Silas Voss, no relation to Thorne despite the shared first name, and he kept his shop at the end of the main street with a black-painted sign that read simply Voss and Sons, caskets and fine furniture, though there was no son yet to speak of, only a nephew learning the trade. Jasper found him there the same afternoon, still shaking with a grief he did not fully understand, because he did not know whether to be grieving or hoping, and both feelings tore at him with equal force. "The grave up on the ridge road," Jasper said, before Voss had even finished setting down the coffin lid he was sanding. "The one marked Adeline Foster. I need to know what happened. I need to know everything." Voss set down his tools and studied Jasper a long moment, as though weighing how much a grieving stranger deserved to know. "You would be the cowboy Miss Crawford used to speak of," Voss said finally. "The one who went east with the herds." "I am, Jasper Prescott. Please, Mr. Voss, tell me what you know." Voss wiped his hands on his apron and gestured for Jasper to sit on an overturned crate, which Jasper did not do, being too restless to sit for anything. "There was talk in June that Virginia Crawford had run off," Voss said carefully. "Word came from a supply wagon out of the Sweetwater crossing that a young woman answering her description had fallen ill and died along the trail, traveling with another woman, a stranger to these parts. The body was brought back for burial by some freighters who found her, and the only paper found on her person carried the name Adeline Foster, so that is what we carved on the marker, since we had no other proof to go on." "Then, why does the town believe it is Virginia's grave?" Jasper asked, his voice rising with a frustration that had nowhere else to go. "Because her horse was found tied near where the body lay, and her shawl was wrapped around the woman when they found her, the very shawl half of Cedar Creek had seen her wear to church 100 times. Mr. Thorne himself identified the shawl. He said it was proof enough for him, and being that he held claim to the Crawford land through the old debts, and being that no kin remained to argue otherwise, the matter was considered settled." Something cold moved through Jasper's chest at the mention of Thorne's name, though he did not yet understand why. "But the marker does not carry her name," Jasper said again, as though saying it enough times might force the world to make sense. "No," Voss agreed slowly, and something shifted behind his careful eyes, as though he too had wondered about it and never quite let himself finish the thought. "It does not. We asked Mr. Thorne about that very thing, and he said it did not matter, that the poor woman likely never carried papers of her own, and had simply taken up the name of whoever she was traveling with, the way strangers on the road sometimes do for safekeeping. He wanted the matter closed quickly. He said it would spare the town from prying questions, and you believed him." Voss looked uncomfortable now, the careful mask of a man who dealt in death and formality slipping just slightly to reveal the ordinary uncertainty underneath. "Mr. Prescott, Silas Thorne is not a man whose word one questions twice in this town, not if one wishes to keep doing business here. But I will tell you this. I built that coffin myself, and I laid that woman to rest with my own 2 hands, and she was younger than Virginia Crawford by some years, with fair hair where Miss Crawford's was dark as a raven's wing, and a face I had never once seen in Cedar Creek in all my years here. I said nothing, because it was not my place, and because Mr. Thorne's account seemed to satisfy the town well enough. But I have wondered, Mr. Prescott. God forgive me, I have wondered every day since." Jasper stood very still for a long moment, feeling something enormous shifting inside his chest, grief and hope tangled together so tightly he could not tell which one was winning. "Where can I find the freighters who brought the body back?" he asked. "Gone north to Montana Territory by now, most likely with the fall shipments. But there is another man you might speak with. Obadiah Lang drives the stage line between here and Sweetwater Crossing, and beyond that to Silver Bend. If any 2 women traveled that road together in June, He is like as not to have carried them a stretch of it himself, or to know who did. Jasper Prescott left the undertaker's shop with his heart hammering against his ribs, and for the first time since kneeling at that grave, he allowed himself to feel something other than grief. He allowed himself to feel hope, dangerous and fragile as it was, and he rode straight for the stage depot at the edge of town before the light could fail him. Obadiah Lang was a broad, weathered man with a gray beard stained yellow at the corners from pipe smoke, and he was greasing the axle of his coach when Jasper found him, and he did not stop his work even as Jasper approached, though he listened well enough when Jasper explained what he was after. 2 women, you say, heading toward Sweetwater in June. Lang straightened up slow, wiping his hands on a rag that had long since given up being clean. I carried a pair of ladies that stretch back in June, now you mention it. One dark-haired, one fair. Kept mostly to themselves, though the dark-haired one had eyes that never sat still, like she was watching the road behind us more than the road ahead. Do you remember their names? The fair one called herself Adeline. Sweet girl, headed for Oregon to find her brother, she said, though she looked poorly even then, coughing something fierce. The other one. Lang paused, scratching at his beard. The other one did not give a name easy, took some asking. Called herself Ginny, I believe, though I recall thinking it an odd short way to say a longer name. Jasper felt his knees nearly give out beneath him. Virginia, he said. Her name would have been Virginia. Could well have been. I do not pry into a paying passenger's business, Mr. Prescott, so long as the fare is honest coin. Where did you leave them? Sweetwater Crossing, same as always. Told them the road onward to Silver Bend was rough going without a wagon, and the fair one, Adeline, she was looking worse by the hour, fever sweat on her the whole ride, poor thing. I offered to carry them further if they could wait for my return trip, but the dark-haired one, Ginny, she said they could not wait, said they needed to keep moving. Last I saw of them, they were walking off toward the freight road with nothing but a single mule between them, and whatever they carried on their backs. And you never saw them again. Not until the freighters brought back word of a body found along that stretch some weeks later. I confess I did wonder when I heard tell, but a man in my line of work learns not to ask too many questions about passengers who have already gone on their way. It does not pay well to be curious in this territory, Mr. Prescott, not when certain men hold as much sway as Silas Thorne does hereabouts. Jasper looked hard at the old driver. You know something more. Lang was quiet a moment, studying Jasper's face as though deciding something important. I know that Silas Thorne sent 2 of his riders out along that same road not 2 weeks past, asking after any woman matching a certain description who might have passed through Silver Bend recent. School teacher, they were asking after. Young, dark-haired, keeps to herself. If the woman he buried under that marker truly was Virginia Crawford, Mr. Prescott, then I cannot say why a man would spend good money hunting a ghost. Something fierce and clean cut through Jasper's grief in that instant, burning away the last of his doubt, and in its place rose a certainty that felt like the first solid ground he had stood on since riding into Cedar Creek. She was alive. Virginia was alive, and Thorne knew it, or at least suspected it strongly enough to go looking, which meant Jasper had no time to waste standing around asking careful questions in dusty stage depots. I need passage to Silver Bend, Jasper said. Tonight, if it can be arranged. Lang studied him a long moment, then nodded slowly, some old cowboy's instinct for the shape of true things settling the matter for him. There is a supply wagon leaving before dawn, headed that direction with flour and nails for the mercantile there. I know the driver. For the right consideration, I imagine he would not mind an extra passenger and horse. Name your price, Jasper said. I have money enough and I will not haggle over it. Then get some rest, son, because it is a hard 2 days' ride even by wagon, and if that woman truly is who you believe her to be, and if Thorne's men are looking for her too, you will want your wits about you when you arrive. Jasper Prescott spent that night in the loft of Mrs. Odell's boarding house barn, unable to sleep for more than an hour at a stretch. his mind circling endlessly between the marker on the hillside and the name Obadiah Lang had spoken, Ginny, a short way of saying a longer name, and the fierce, unbearable hope that the woman he loved had somehow survived whatever desperate circumstance had driven her out onto that lonely road in the first place. He thought, too, of Sela's Thorn, and what kind of man hunted a woman he believed already dead and buried, and the coldness of that thought kept him company through the long hours until the wagon rolled out of Cedar Creek before the sun had even cleared the eastern ridgeline. The road to Silver Bend cut through open range country, broken here and there by stands of cottonwood along dry creek beds and outcroppings of pale rock that caught the autumn light like old bone. Jasper rode alongside the supply wagon on his own horse rather than crowd the bed among the flour sacks, and the driver, a taciturn man named Purdy, seemed content to let him keep his own silence, which suited Jasper well enough, since his mind had no room left over for idle talk. They made camp the first night beside a shallow creek, and Jasper lay awake staring up at a sky thick with more stars than a man could ever hope to count, and he found himself talking, quietly, to no one in particular, the way lonesome men sometimes do beneath a big enough sky. "I am coming, Virginia," he said, to the stars, to the dark, to whatever part of the universe might carry the words to her. "I do not know what happened to you, or what drove you out onto that road, but I am coming, and I will not let anything stand between us again. Not distance, not time, not any man with money enough to think he can buy what does not belong to him." Purdy, half asleep by the fire, grunted something that might have been agreement or might have simply been a man rolling over in his blankets, and Jasper allowed himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, something close to peace. On the second day, some 15 miles outside Silver Bend, they came upon two riders resting their horses at a small spring beside the road, and something in the set of their shoulders and the quality of their guns, well-oiled and worn at the hip in a manner that spoke of frequent use, told Jasper before they even spoke a word that these were not ordinary travelers. "Afternoon," the taller of the two said, touching his hat brim in a gesture that managed to be both polite and vaguely threatening at once. "You folks headed into Silver Bend?" "We are," Purdy answered, his voice carefully neutral in the way of a man who has learned to be cautious around strangers on lonesome roads. "Mind if we ask your business there? We are looking for a woman name of Foster, schoolteacher, we hear tell, come to town sometime this past summer. Dark hair, slight build, keeps mostly to herself. Our employer has urgent business with her concerning some property matters back in Cedar Creek." Jasper kept his face still through sheer force of will, though his heart was slamming against his ribs so hard he feared the men might hear it. "Never heard of her," Purdy said, which was true enough, since Purdy had heard the name only from Jasper's own mouth 2 days prior, and Jasper silently thanked him for the small mercy of an honest man's poker face. The rider's eyes moved to Jasper, taking in his trail-worn coat, his horse, the set of his jaw. "And you, friend? You look like a man who has ridden some distance." "Cattle business," Jasper said, keeping his voice easy, though every instinct in him wanted to reach for the pistol at his hip. "Nothing that would interest your employer, I imagine." The rider studied him a moment longer, then seemed to decide the answer satisfied him well enough, or at least was not worth the trouble of pressing further out on an open road with witnesses present. "Well, if you should happen to hear tell of this Miss Foster in your travels, there is a fair reward for information leading to her whereabouts. Mr. Thorne is a generous man to those who help him." "I will keep it in mind," Jasper said, and the two riders mounted up and continued on down the road toward Cedar Creek, and Jasper did not breathe easy again until they had long since disappeared over the horizon behind them. "Thorne's men," Purdy said quietly once they were well and truly alone again. "I have heard tell of that outfit. Hard men, most of them former hired guns from the range wars down south. You want to be careful, Mr. Prescott, whatever business you have got waiting for you in Silver Bend." "I mean to be," Jasper said, but I mean to get there first, whatever it costs." They pushed on through the afternoon and into the evening, and Silver Bend came into view at last just as the sun was setting behind the western hills, a modest town of perhaps 400 souls, built up along a wide bend in a river that gave the place its name, with a proper main street of false-fronted buildings, a church with a real steeple, and Jasper noted with his heart climbing into his throat, a small schoolhouse at the northern edge of town with a single lamp still burning in its window. He did not wait for Purdy to finish unhitching the wagon at the mercantile. He simply turned his tired horse toward that small square of lamplight and rode, and if anyone in Silver Bend that evening thought it strange to see a trail-worn stranger galloping through the center of town at dusk, none of them said a word about it, because something in the set of his face made it clear he was a man riding towards something that mattered more than town gossip. He reined up outside the schoolhouse and swung down before his horse had fully stopped moving, and he stood for a moment in the gathering dark, his hand actually trembling, a grown man who had faced down stampeding cattle and armed drunkards and a winter jail cell without once losing his composure. And now he stood shaking outside a one-room schoolhouse because he was afraid, more afraid than he had ever been of anything, that he had gotten it all wrong, that the woman inside was not who he hoped. That hope itself might prove to be the cruelest thing of all. He knocked. There was a long pause, footsteps crossing a wooden floor, and then the door opened, and the lamplight fell across a face that Jasper Prescott had carried in his memory across 400 miles of cattle trail, through a jail cell in Abilene, and now across a graveyard and 2 days of desperate riding. And for a moment neither of them said anything at all, because some moments are too large for words to hold. "Jasper," Virginia Crawford said, and her voice broke on the single word, and the lamp in her hand shook so badly that hot wax spilled over her fingers and she did not even seem to notice. "Virginia." His own voice came out rough, unfamiliar to his own ears. "God in heaven, it is you." She set the lamp down on the small table just inside the door with hands that would not stop trembling, and then she was in his arms, and he was holding her so tightly he feared he might hurt her, though she was holding him back with equal fierceness, both of them shaking, both of them weeping without shame in the doorway of a schoolhouse in a town neither of them had ever expected to matter to their story. "I thought you were dead," he said into her hair, which smelled of chalk dust and lavender soap and something else that was simply her, unchanged despite everything. "I found your grave, Virginia. I knelt at a grave I believed was yours." She pulled back just enough to look at him, and her eyes, dark and wet with tears, searched his face as though she too could not quite believe he was real. "Adeline," she said quietly, "you found Adeline's grave. I did not know it was her name until I read the marker. Voss the undertaker, he told me the whole town believed it was you because of your horse, your shawl. Thorne told them it was you." Something hardened in Virginia's face at the mention of Thorne's name, an anger that Jasper had never seen in her before, and he understood in that moment that whatever had happened to drive her out onto that lonesome road, Silas Thorne stood at the very center of it. "Come inside," she said. "Please. There is so much I have to tell you, and I do not think either of us wants to say it standing in a doorway with half of Silver Bend able to hear." She lit a second lamp once he had stepped inside and closed the door behind him, and the small schoolroom filled with warm light, rows of simple wooden desks, a slate board still marked with the multiplication tables from that day's lessons, a shelf of well-worn primers, and Jasper thought, even in the midst of everything, how like her it was to have built herself a whole life here, teaching children their letters, in the short months since he had last seen her. "Tell me everything," he said, taking the seat she offered him at her small writing desk, while she sat across from him, her hands finally still now, folded tightly in her lap. "Start from the beginning. I have been chasing pieces of this story for 3 days, and my heart cannot take much more guessing." So she told him. She told him how her father had sickened that first hard winter after Jasper left, a cough that would not clear, turning to pneumonia by January, and how she had nursed him through the worst of it alone, since most of the hired hands had scattered to other ranches once it became clear the Crawford outfit was struggling, and how he had died in February of 1878, leaving her alone with a ranch mortgaged more heavily than she had ever known. Debts her father had taken out years before to expand the herd, debts held entirely by one man. Silas Thorne came to pay his respects within a week of the funeral, Virginia said, her voice flat with the particular exhaustion of someone who has told a painful story enough times in her own head that speaking it aloud has become almost mechanical. He was very kind at first, very understanding. He said he had always admired my father, that he wished to help however he could. It was only after the second visit that he mentioned the debts, and only after the third that he mentioned marriage, as though it were the most natural solution in the world. Forgive the debt entirely, he said, in exchange for my hand. He said I would want for nothing. He said it as though he were offering me a great kindness. And you refused him, Jasper said, though it was not truly a question. I refused him every time he asked, and each time his kindness grew a little thinner, a little more like a threat wearing kindness as a mask. By spring he had stopped asking politely. He told me the debt would be called due in full by summer's end, and that I had no way to pay it, and that the ranch would pass to him regardless of whether I married him or not, and that my only choice was whether I left that ranch as his wife or as a woman with nothing at all. Jasper's hands had curled into fists on the desk without his noticing, and Virginia reached across and gently uncurled them, holding his hands in both of hers as she continued. I could not marry him, Jasper. I could not. Not when I had already given my heart to you, and not when everything in me told me that a man who speaks of love the way he threatens debt collection is no man I could ever trust with my life. So I made a decision. I sold what cattle I could without his knowledge, enough to buy passage and provisions, and I planned to leave Cedar Creek entirely, to go somewhere he could never find me, to start over under a different name if that was what it took. How did you come to travel with Adeline Foster? Virginia's eyes softened with a grief that was clearly still raw, even months later. I met her at the Sweetwater Crossing. She was traveling alone, heading for Oregon to find a brother she had not seen in 6 years, and she was already unwell when I met her, though neither of us understood yet how serious it was. We fell in together simply because 2 women traveling alone felt safer than one, and we talked the whole first day as though we had known each other our whole lives. She was kind, Jasper, kinder than anyone had been to me in months. She had lost her own family to fever back in Missouri, and she said she understood what it was to lose everything and have to build a new life from nothing. It was her idea then to trade names. It was. She said it half in jest at first, sitting by our campfire the second night, teasing that we ought to trade troubles the way we traded stories, since her name carried no weight of debt or angry cattle barons behind it, while mine, she said, sounded like trouble enough to attract attention on any road in the territory. But when her fever worsened 3 days later, and she understood she was truly dying, she made me promise Jasper. She made me promise to take her name and her papers so that if anyone came asking after Virginia Crawford along that road, they would find nothing but a grave and I would be free of Thorne forever. Her voice caught, and she pressed the back of one hand hard against her mouth for a moment before continuing. I did not want to do it. I told her it felt like a betrayal of her own memory, taking her name while giving her mine to carry into whatever comes after this life. But she insisted. She said a name was the only gift she had left to give, and she wanted it to mean something, and she made me swear to live a good life with it, to make it worth the giving. I buried her myself, Jasper, with my own 2 hands, out along that road, and I carved her real name into the marker with a knife, because it was the only truth I had to give her back, even though it meant the whole territory would believe it was me instead. I could not bear to leave her nameless in the ground, whatever story the world chose to believe about the grave itself. Jasper sat in silence a long moment, absorbing the full weight of it, the terrible arithmetic of grief and survival that had brought them to this small, lamplit schoolroom. "You have been living here as her," he said finally, "as Adeline Foster." "I have. The town needed a schoolteacher, and I had the letters of reference Adeline carried with her, real enough, since she truly had trained as a teacher back in Missouri before her family died. I took the position under her name because it seemed the safest way to disappear entirely, to become someone Thorne would never think to look for. I have taught these children for 4 months now, Jasper, and some days I have almost believed I truly am her, that Virginia Crawford really did die on that road, and only Adeline Foster remains." "You are not her," Jasper said fiercely, taking her face gently in his hands. "Whatever name is written on any paper or any marker, you are Virginia Crawford, and you always will be, and I have loved that name since the first evening I heard you read Shakespeare to a corral full of cowboys who could not tell a sonnet from a cattle brand." She laughed then, a wet, surprised sound, half sob and half real laughter, the first he had heard from her since he arrived, and something in his chest eased at the sound of it, as though the whole world had tilted back toward right. "Thorne's men are looking for you," Jasper said, once the moment had softened enough for practical worry to reassert itself. "I passed 2 of them on the road not 15 miles from here, asking after a schoolteacher named Foster. They know Virginia, or at least they suspect enough to keep searching." Fear flickered back into her eyes, quick and sharp. "How would they know to look here?" "I do not know. Perhaps someone in Cedar Creek remembered you speaking of Silver Bend once, or perhaps Thorne's men have simply been working through every town along that road with a school in it. However they came to suspect, they are close and they will not stop looking, not with whatever business he claims to have with you." "It is not business," Virginia said bitterly. "It is the ranch. My father's will named me sole heir, but Thorne holds the debt papers, and Wyoming territory law being what it is, a woman's claim to property is thin enough even when she is alive to defend it herself. If he can prove I am dead with no other kin to inherit, the land passes to him outright as settlement of the debt. But if I am alive, he must either force my hand in marriage or find some other way to make me sign the land over, and either way, he needs to find me first." "Then we will not let him," Jasper said, with a certainty that surprised even himself. "I did not ride 400 miles and kneel weeping at a stranger's grave to lose you now to a man who thinks a debt paper gives him the right to a woman's whole life. What do you mean to do?" "I mean to go back to Cedar Creek with you, and I mean to pay that debt myself, every dollar of it, with the wages I have earned these 2 years driving cattle, and I mean to see Silas Thorne's claim on that land dissolved so completely that he has no reason left to trouble you ever again." Virginia stared at him, and something in her face, hope warring visibly with disbelief, made his chest ache with tenderness. "You would spend everything you earned, everything you meant to build a home with, on paying off my father's debt." "I would spend it twice over if I had it," Jasper said simply. "I never wanted that money for its own sake, Virginia. I wanted it so I could come back to you with something to offer besides empty hands. If the best thing it can do is buy you your freedom and your home, then it has already done exactly what I always meant it to do." She wept again then, but differently this time, and he held her through it. And outside the schoolhouse window the last light faded from the western sky, and the first stars began to show themselves over Silver Bend. Indifferent and patient as they had always been, as they would be long after every debt and every grave marker and every cruel man's ambition had turned to dust. They did not linger long in Silver Bend once the plan was decided, because both of them understood that every day spent waiting was a day Thorne's men might close the distance. And Virginia, for all the peace she had found teaching children their letters in that small schoolroom, knew that peace had only ever been borrowed time. She gathered what few belongings she had accumulated in her months as Adeline Foster, resigning her position with the school board the following morning with a letter that gave no true explanation, only thanks and an apology for the suddenness of her departure. And by noon, she and Jasper were riding east alongside Purdy's now empty supply wagon, retracing the very road that had first carried her away from everything she knew. The ride back was tenser than the ride out had been, both of them watching the horizon for riders, both of them speaking in low voices even when there was no one within miles to overhear. And it was on the second night, camped again beside the same shallow creek where Jasper had spoken his private promise to the stars, that they finally allowed themselves a quiet hour of something other than fear. "Tell me about the cattle drive," Virginia said, sitting close beside him by the small fire, her head resting against his shoulder in a way that felt, after everything, almost unbearably ordinary and good. "Tell me what kept you so long, before I ever learned the truth of it back in Cedar Creek. I used to imagine every terrible thing, you know. I imagined you had found some other woman further east, prettier and more sensible than me, who did not spend her evenings arguing with cowboys about Shakespeare." "There is no woman more sensible than you," Jasper said, "and precious few prettier, though I will admit the competition for prettier was not entirely absent." He earned a soft laugh and a swat to his arm for that, and continued more seriously. "It was a jail cell in Abilene, if you want the plain truth of it. A saloon fight I had no part in starting, but I was the fool who tried to pull two drunk men apart, and by the time the marshals sorted out who had actually done the stabbing, 3 months had gone by, and every letter I sent explaining myself seems to have gotten lost somewhere between there and here." "3 months in a jail cell," Virginia said softly, "and you never once thought to give up and simply stay in Kansas, put the whole miserable business behind you." "Virginia," Jasper said, turning to look at her fully in the firelight, "I sat in that cell counting days not because I feared punishment, but because every single one of them was a day further from you than I had ever intended to be. I would have sat there 3 years if that was what it took, so long as I knew that at the end of it, you would still be waiting." "I very nearly was not," she said quietly, some old fear surfacing in her voice. "There were nights on that road to Sweetwater when I thought I might simply lie down in the grass and let the whole world go on without me, and only Adeline's stubborn kindness kept me walking. I owe her a debt I can never repay, Jasper, and I mean to see it paid however I can, once we have settled things with Thorne. We will see her properly remembered," Jasper said. "A true marker with her true story, if not the whole truth of the trade you two made, then at least the truth of a woman who showed such kindness to a stranger that she gave her name away to save her. That much we owe her, and that much we will do." They rode into Cedar Creek 2 days later, in the gray hour just after dawn, and the town was only beginning to stir, smoke rising from a handful of chimneys, the blacksmith's forge already glowing at the edge of the main street. And Jasper felt Virginia's hand tighten on the reins beside him as the familiar buildings came into view: the boarding house, the mercantile, the church with its modest white steeple, all of it exactly as she had left it, and yet entirely changed by everything that had happened since. "We will go to the sheriff first," Jasper said, "before Thorne has any chance to hear we have arrived. Walt Hutchins is an honest man, or at least honest enough, and if we can show him the debt papers and prove the identity mix-up at the grave, he can hold Thorne's claim in question long enough for us to settle things properly through the Territorial Land Office." They found Sheriff Hutchins at the small jailhouse office, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with a mustache gone entirely gray, and a manner that suggested he had seen enough of Cedar Creek's business over the years to be surprised by very little. His surprise at seeing Virginia Crawford standing very much alive in his office doorway, however, was considerable, and it took him a long moment and several attempts before he managed to speak at all. "Miss Crawford," he said finally, "I will be switched. We buried you 3 months back. I stood at that graveside myself." "You buried a woman named Adeline Foster, Sheriff," Virginia said steadily, "who died of fever on the road to Sweetwater, and who was kind enough in her final hours to trade names with me so that I might escape a marriage I did not want and a debt I did not owe. I am very much alive, and I have come to settle the matter of my father's ranch once and for all." It took the better part of an hour to lay the whole story out for Hutchins, with Jasper filling in the pieces gathered from Voss and from Obadiah Lang, and the sheriff listened with his arms crossed and his face growing steadily grimmer as the picture became clear. "Thorne told this whole town you were dead," Hutchins said finally. "He stood right there at Voss's shop and identified that shawl as yours, plain as day, and pushed hard to have the matter closed quick and quiet. A man does not do that, Miss Crawford, unless he has some particular interest in the matter being settled a certain way." "He has interest enough," Virginia said. "With me presumed dead and no other kin to inherit, my father's debt converts the ranch to his outright. He as good as told me so himself before I left. Then we had better see about proving you very much alive before he can do anything further with those papers," Hutchins said, standing and reaching for his hat. "I will send word to Judge Reams over in Laramie asking him to ride out and settle the land matter proper, since this is beyond what I can decide on my own authority. But in the meantime, Miss Crawford, I think it best we keep your return quiet a while longer, at least until the judge arrives, and the matter can be settled with proper legal footing behind it. A man like Thorne might do something foolish if he feels his prize slipping away with no lawful process to stop him." It was, in the end, exactly the sort of caution the sheriff had feared, because word travels fast in a small territory, and it was not 2 days later, while Virginia and Jasper were staying quietly at Mrs. Odell's boarding house awaiting the judge's arrival, that Silas Thorne himself came riding into town with 4 of his hired riders behind him, having heard, through some channel none of them could later trace with certainty, that the schoolteacher his men had been hunting in Silver Bend had turned up very much alive and very much back in Cedar Creek. Jasper was standing on the boarding house porch when Thorne's party rode up the main street, and he recognized the man immediately from Virginia's description, tall, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of handsome, weathered face that might have seemed trustworthy to a stranger who did not know to look for the coldness sitting behind his eyes. "Prescott, is it?" Thorne said, reining up in front of the boarding house without dismounting, his 4 riders spreading out casually behind him in a manner that was clearly meant to intimidate rather than merely to accompany. "I hear you have brought back quite a surprise from Silver Bend." "I have brought back the truth," Jasper said, standing his ground on the porch step, "which is more than this town has had from you in some months, Mr. Thorne." Thorne's smile did not waver, though something hardened briefly behind his eyes. "I do not know what tale that woman has spun for you, cowboy, but the law in this territory is plain enough. Thomas Crawford's debts fall to his estate, and with his only heir presumed lost, that estate falls to the man holding the note. I have been more than patient waiting for the matter to settle proper." "She is not lost," Virginia said, stepping out onto the porch beside Jasper, her chin lifted in a way that Jasper recognized from 100 small moments of her stubborn courage over the years he had known her. "I am standing right here, Mr. Thorne, alive and well, and I have already spoken with Sheriff Hutchins, who has sent for Judge Reams to settle the matter of my father's estate according to proper law." Something flickered across Thorne's face then, quick and ugly, gone almost as fast as it appeared, but Jasper saw it, and understood in that instant that whatever careful patience Thorne had shown these past months was wearing dangerously thin. "You ran from a fair offer of marriage, Miss Crawford," Thorne said, his voice dropping into something quieter and more dangerous than his earlier bluster. "You let this whole town believe you dead, buried some poor stranger under a false story, and now you mean to march back into town and simply undo everything as though none of it happened. The debt still stands. The papers still say what they say. Judge or no judge, the law favors the man holding the note when a woman cannot produce coin enough to settle it herself." "Then it is fortunate," Jasper said, stepping forward and drawing from inside his coat the leather satchel he had carried nearly the whole width of the territory. "That I have coin enough to settle it in full today, in front of witnesses, so that this matter need never trouble the judge's patience at all." He counted it out right there on the porch railing, the full wages of 2 hard years driving cattle to the railhead, more money than most men in Cedar Creek had ever seen gathered in one place, and a small crowd had begun to gather on the street by then, drawn by the sight of Thorne's riders and the raised voices. And Jasper found he did not mind the audience one bit, because some things deserve to be settled where the whole town can see the truth of them plainly. "That is every dollar of the debt my father owed, and a fair measure more besides, for the trouble and grief your collection tactics have caused," Virginia said, her voice carrying clear across the gathered crowd. "I will have Sheriff Hutchins witness the payment and record it proper, and you will sign the note satisfied in full, Mr. Thorne, or I will see to it that Judge Reams hears every detail of how you identified a stranger's body as mine to speed along your own claim to my father's land, which I imagine a territorial judge would take a rather dim view of, whatever the debt papers might say." The street had gone very quiet, and Thorne sat on his horse for a long, tense moment, his jaw working, his eyes moving between Jasper's steady stance and the small mountain of coin and paper currency laid out on the porch railing. And Jasper understood that this was the moment the whole matter would turn one way or another, and he found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, entirely unafraid. "You would humiliate me in the street over a debt you were never going to be able to pay," Thorne said finally, though the bluster had gone out of his voice, replaced by something more calculating. "I would settle an honest debt fairly," Jasper said, "which is more consideration than you showed a grieving young woman when you came calling with marriage offers wrapped around threats not 2 weeks after she buried her father. Take the payment, Mr. Thorne, and sign the release, and this can end here today, without ever troubling a judge or this town's good opinion of you any further than it already has." For a long moment nobody moved, and then, slowly, deliberately, Silas Thorne dismounted, and Sheriff Hutchins, who had come up the street at the first sign of trouble and stood now at the edge of the gathered crowd, stepped forward with the appropriate papers already in hand, having anticipated, with the particular foresight of a good lawman, exactly how this confrontation was likely to unfold. "I will witness the payment and the release both," Hutchins said, "and I will record it at the land office myself before nightfall, so there is no question raised later about the proper settling of this matter." Thorne signed the release with a hand that trembled slightly with barely suppressed fury, and when it was done, he mounted his horse without another word to either Jasper or Virginia, though as he turned to ride out of town, he paused and looked back at them both with an expression that carried more than simple defeat in it. "You have made an enemy today, cowboy," he said quietly, low enough that only Jasper and Virginia and the sheriff standing nearby could hear it. "I do not forget debts of any kind, paid or otherwise. Then remember this one well, Mr. Thorne," Sheriff Hutchins said, stepping in before Jasper could answer, his voice carrying the particular authority of a lawman who has decided he has heard quite enough. "Because I intend to keep a close watch on your dealings in this county from here forward, and if you have any further business that involves identifying strangers' bodies to suit your own convenience, I will see you answer for it before a judge whether you like it or not." Thorne said nothing further, only wheeled his horse and rode out of Cedar Creek with his riders trailing behind him, and the gathered crowd watched them go in a silence that gradually broke into low murmurs of astonishment, and here and there, quiet satisfaction, because a town remembers, even when it does not always speak of it, when one of its own has been wronged. Virginia sagged against Jasper's side the moment the riders were out of sight, all the fierce composure of the last few minutes suddenly draining out of her at once, and he caught her, holding her upright with an arm around her waist, feeling the tremor that ran through her whole body now that the danger had finally passed. "It is done," he said softly against her hair. "It is truly done, Virginia. He has no more claim on you or your father's land, not ever again." "I still cannot quite believe it," she whispered. "3 days ago I was Adeline Foster, teaching multiplication tables to children in Silver Bend, certain I would spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. And now—" "And now you are exactly who you always were," Jasper said, tilting her chin up gently so she would look at him. "Virginia Crawford, home at last, with nothing left standing between us." The gathered crowd, sensing perhaps that the moment called for something gentler than continued spectacle, began to disperse back to their morning business, though more than a few glanced back with soft smiles at the sight of the young cowboy and the schoolteacher, who was not really a schoolteacher, standing together on the boarding house porch, and Mrs. Odell, watching from her doorway with her broom forgotten entirely in her hands, dabbed at her eyes with the corner of her apron and said, to no one in particular, that it was about time. This town had a wedding worth celebrating. Judge Reams arrived 4 days later, somewhat unnecessary now that the debt had been settled by direct payment, but he confirmed the land office records all the same, entering into the county ledger the formal and permanent recognition that Virginia Crawford was alive, that she held clear and unencumbered title to her father's ranch along the creek bottom, and that the woman buried on the ridge road above town had been, according to all evidence gathered, one Adeline Foster of Missouri, a traveler who had died of fever on the Sweetwater Road, and whose true identity and true kindness deserved proper and permanent memorial. It was Virginia herself who commissioned the new marker from Voss the undertaker, a proper stone this time rather than the hasty wooden one that had first misled Jasper on that terrible autumn afternoon, and she wrote the inscription herself, in the same neat hand her father had once praised for its account-keeping precision, though this time the words carried a very different kind of ledger entirely. Adeline Foster, it read, beloved friend, whose final kindness gave a stranger back her life. May she rest in the peace she so generously gave to another. They stood together at that grave on a cold, clear afternoon in early November, Jasper's arm around Virginia's shoulders, the whole story of debt and disguise and desperate flight finally laid to rest alongside the woman who had made it possible. "I will visit her every year," Virginia said quietly. "I will bring my children here someday if God grants us any, and I will tell them her story so that her kindness is never forgotten, whatever name the world happened to write above her bones." "She will not be forgotten," Jasper said, "not while either of us has breath to tell it." They were married 3 weeks later, in the small church at the center of Cedar Creek, on a bright, cold Saturday in late November, with frost still silvering the grass at dawn, and the whole town, it seemed, turned out to fill the wooden pews, Mrs. Odell weeping openly through the entire ceremony, Sheriff Hutchins standing near the back with his hat respectfully in his hands, and Reverend Ezra Combs, who had officiated more funerals that year than weddings, and seemed genuinely delighted for the reversal, speaking the vows with a warmth that filled the small church like sunlight. Virginia wore a simple dress of blue wool, since there had been no time and little occasion in her recent months of hardship to acquire anything finer, but Jasper thought, watching her walk toward him down the narrow aisle, that he had never in his life seen anything more beautiful, and he told her so afterward, at the small gathering held on the porch of what was once again, and would remain, the Crawford Ranch house, now shared between them both. "You told me once you did not need a house with a real floor," he reminded her, as they stood together looking out over the darkening range land that stretched toward the mountains, cattle grazing peacefully in the last light of the day, land that was finally, truly, entirely their own. "You said you only needed a man who came home." "I remember," Virginia said, leaning into his shoulder. "Well, I have come home," Jasper said. "Later than I promised, by a longer and harder road than either of us could have imagined, but I have come home, Virginia Crawford, and I do not intend to ever leave again." "See that you do not," she said, laughing through tears that had become, over the course of that long and difficult year, far more often tears of joy than of grief. Because I have grown rather attached to the idea of growing old on this porch with you, watching whatever children we are blessed with learn to ride before they can properly walk, the way both our own fathers would have wanted for us. They did not have to wait long for that particular blessing. Their first child, a son, was born the following autumn, in September of 1879, a sturdy, dark-haired boy they named Thomas, after Virginia's father, and Jasper held him on the same porch where he had once counted out a fortune in cattle wages to buy back his wife's freedom. And he thought, looking down at that small, red, furious face, that no amount of money he had ever earned on any trail drive had purchased anything half so precious. A daughter followed 2 years after, in 1881, whom they named Adeline, after the woman whose final act of kindness had made their whole life together possible. And Virginia insisted, over Jasper's gentle teasing, that the child had inherited her mother's own stubborn insistence on doing things her own way, that it was only right the name carry forward into a new generation, so that it might mean something more at last than sacrifice and grief alone. 2 more children came in the years that followed. A second son they called Walter, after the sheriff who had stood by them when it mattered most, and a final daughter, Grace, born in 1885, by which time the Crawford Prescott Ranch, as it had come to be known throughout the county, had grown into one of the finest cattle operations in that stretch of Wyoming territory, built not on debt and threat, as Silas Thorne had once intended for it, but on honest work and a marriage that the whole town of Cedar Creek had watched, with something like collective pride, weather every hardship that had been thrown at it and come through stronger for the trial. Silas Thorne, for his part, did not trouble them again directly, though word reached them some years later that his own cattle operation had suffered a string of hard winters and worse decisions, and that he had eventually sold out entirely and moved on to some other territory to try his hand at building a fortune through means that hopefully, though none of them could say for certain, had grown a little more honest with time and hardship to temper him. Every June, without fail, Virginia rode out to the small burying ground on the ridge road above Cedar Creek, sometimes alone in the early years, and later, as her children grew old enough to sit a horse and understand something of loss and gratitude both, she brought them with her, and she told them the story of a kind stranger from Missouri who had given away the only thing she had left to give, her own name, so that a frightened young woman fleeing an unkind fate might have the chance to build the very life that stood gathered now at her graveside, listening with wide, solemn eyes to a story that had, against every terrible odds, found its way to a happy ending after all. Jasper Prescott, who had once knelt weeping at that same grave believing he had lost everything, came to think of it in later years not as the site of his deepest grief, but as the strange and winding place where his whole true life had actually begun, the moment a stranger's name on a wooden marker had refused to make sense to him, and had sent him searching, against every reasonable expectation of grief and finality, for the truth that had ultimately given him back the only woman he had ever loved. And on quiet evenings, sitting together on the porch of the ranch house that bore both their names now in the county records, watching their children chase fireflies across the darkening range, while the cattle settled for the night, and the first stars appeared over the mountains just as they had on that long-ago evening, when Jasper first spoke his promise into the dark, Virginia would sometimes take his hand and say, simply, that she was glad, more glad than she could ever properly put into words, that he had been the kind of man who could not simply accept a lie carved into wood, and had instead ridden 400 miles on nothing but stubborn hope and an unwillingness to believe that love, once truly given, could ever really be laid to rest beneath a stranger's name. "I would have ridden 4,000 miles, Jasper told her every time she said it, "and I would do it again tomorrow and every day after that for as long as you would have me." "Good," Virginia always answered, settling closer against his shoulder as the Wyoming night deepened around them both, "because I intend to have you, Jasper Prescott, for a great many years yet to come." And out on the ridge road above Cedar Creek, beneath a stone marker bearing a name that had once caused so much confusion and grief, and now stood instead as a permanent testament to the strange, generous, and ultimately redemptive turns that a life can take. The woman who had given her name away so that another might live rested in a peace made whole at last by the love and the family and the honest, hard-won happiness that her sacrifice had made possible, exactly as she had asked, and exactly as she deserved.